And with that, I think we are live and on Facebook, live and online on the internet. We got people tuning in already. Hello, everyone out there. My name is John Lustrea. I'm the Education Coordinator at the National Museum of Civil War Medicine. I'm joined today by Dr. Catherine Bateson, and we're going to talk about how Civil War soldiers sang about wounds. Dr. Bateson is a historian of music in the Civil War, among other things, and she's brought with her a number of really interesting examples about how Civil War soldiers sang about death, injury, disease, all sorts of things. So this ought to be a really interesting program. Thank you to all of you tuning in already. We appreciate you tuning in, and we'd love to hear where you're watching from. So go ahead and drop in the comments. I see we got Jennifer from Northeast Ohio. Thanks for being with us today. And we got people all over the country and all over the world tuning in with us. It's always a thrill. So if you enjoy these videos, and we've been doing these videos for, oh my goodness, coming up on a year now, with the National Museum of Civil War Medicine. If you've enjoyed the videos that we do, go ahead and like this video, share this video, tell your friends about it. All of that sharing and liking and watching that you all have done has helped us out immensely throughout this whole time, and we thank you so much for faithfully tuning in. Zach from Naperville, Mary from Florida, Stephen from Colorado, Ann from Maryland, Charles from Minneapolis, Minnesota, Cindy from Missoula, Montana, just a slew of people. We already got close to 125 tuning in already, so that's great. Just a joy to have all you with us. So something that everyone can do for free to help us out, like the video, share the video, anyone can do that. If you want to go the extra mile, consider becoming a member of the museum. And my colleague Jake has dropped in a link there in the comments to sign up and become a member. We've had just tons of people signing up recently. We really appreciate it. Membership supports programs like this, allows us to keep doing what we do, all for the low price, or as low as $25 a year. That's around $2 a month. So that helps us out immensely. You support the museum, get access to our journal, free admission to the museum, discounts in our gift shop, and all that sort of thing. So you get something out of it, you help us, and then we help you. So everybody wins in the end. That's the hope. Let's see, Terry tuning in from Pittsburgh, Barbara from New Jersey, one of our longtime watchers, Thomas tuning in from Chapel Hill. We got, and then Helen tuning in from Western Colorado, Wayne from Pennsylvania. A lot of people watching. Thank you so much. So again, my name is John Lustrea, Education Coordinator at the National Museum of Civil War Medicine, joined by Dr. Catherine Bateson. And if you have any questions during the program, go ahead and drop them in the comments. We'll do our best to get to as many as we can. With so many people watching these days, it's hard to keep up with all the questions, but we'll do our best to get to them all. So fantastic. Let's see. So Catherine, to get us started with, maybe just because you are one of our repeat guests, we're glad to have you back. Maybe just refresh everyone with who you are, what you do, and how you came to study music in particular.
Yeah, so thank you very much for having me back. I've been really looking forward to this ever since our last chat. Yeah, so as John said, I'm a historian of specifically Irish American experiences of the Civil War and their songs and their music and their cultural output during the 1860s, also a little bit pre-war as well. And that's sort of my research job. And then my day job is I teach 19th century history at the University of Durham here in the northeast of the UK. And yeah, I mean, I've always loved American Civil War history ever since I was really little, and became obsessed by Lincoln and trying to understand the causes of the Civil War and sort of the different tensions and social changes and developments of the war. And it was during my master's study where I started doing research into Civil War songs and thought this sounds like a good idea for a project. And that's basically been everything in my life since about 2013, which I think when I properly started investigating the first of Civil War songs. And yeah, as I said, the main thing I look at is the Irish experience. So there will be several Irish examples today, mainly because they really like singing about the topic that we're going to talk about. Yeah, it's a everyday kind of reading all these different songs and lyrics. There's always something new. Even just finding the songs for this talk, I found examples that I couldn't remember that I'd come across. So yeah, I just really love this topic.
Yeah, there's a lot to love when it comes to music, no question about that. And the Civil War, I think in particular, is a very rich period when it comes to music. Well, I think you shared with us when you were on last time, what was it, 16,000 songs composed or something like that?
Slightly more, it's slightly under, it's 11,000, but they're probably, I mean, there's all the hundreds that we don't have as records or are waiting because they're sitting in, hand penciled records. And things like that, but it's about, I would say, is a good guess, about 11,000. So yeah, it's a hugely, that's just over 4 years. So it's a hugely prolific period for production.
Yeah, I'm still trying to wrap my head around that 11,000 number ever since we spoke last time. So it's just wild. So and which brings us to today with so many songs out there. There's a song about pretty much everything that you could possibly imagine. And today we're going to focus on some of the more macabre type songs that talk about death, wounds, sickness, and things of that nature. You know. Obviously, you haven't looked at every song ever written during the Civil War, but in what you have looked at, how common was that to write about this sort of subject?
Yeah, it's surprisingly more common than you would think. And I think actually this is what kind of generated the idea for this talk when we kind of just casually talking about it last time around, that actually there's a surprising amount of references to not just the fighting on the battlefield and what's happening in the battles themselves and certain particular actions of individuals or of whole regiments and units, but then there's an increasing amount from pretty early on, from the First Bull Run onwards, of references to soldiers dying, and then it becomes more graphic. So some of them become very specific about how those soldiers are dying, and then you hear the voices of the dying soldiers. They're singing some of these lyrics, and it just develops more and more and more. And so I've whittled it down. I don't think we'll get through all 25 of them, but I found 25 out of a good 250 songs earlier. But it's a topic that is there, and the death and the sort of inevitable outcome of battle and of war is there, even in the background too of sort of other ones about giving thanks for sort of service and sacrifice as well. So it's a very familiar topic, almost to the point where until you're looking for it, you don't actually realize what's going on.
Yeah, I would expect it's sort of like sensory history in that way. Sensory history is, where people go back and revisit familiar sources, but they focus on, the senses. How are they describing smell, taste, sight, feel, all that sort of thing. So it's almost like you're going back to things that are sort of familiar, but when you're looking for something specific, it's amazing how sometimes it's just sitting there right under your nose.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's a few that I love in my research, particularly about the Irish blood sacrifice for the war, which I'll come on to with some lyrics that I knew and remembered straight away, including one very gory death that is sung about. But yeah, actually going through it all, you realize that there's quite a lot that's there. So it's, yeah, as I said, it's a very familiar trope.
And I'm sure we'll talk about this as we go along, but what stuck out to me when you were talking earlier is how these songs get sort of more graphic as the war goes on, which I think probably correlates with the country's, being continually acquainted with these kind of gruesome images, starting with photographs, infamously in 1862, death becomes much less abstract and much more real. And so I would theorize that probably has something to do with the increasingly descriptive lyrics.
Yeah, I definitely, yeah. I mean, it's good to kind of mention photography almost straight away, because I think one of the ways of thinking about this is that, you know, we're dealing with a 19th century Victorian American society that is very comfortable with death, in that, you know, it's something that is a part of an everyday process, in a way that we don't really see to this day, certainly in British and American culture. And always when I ever teach kind of Civil War photography to students, I kind of point out that it's very shocking to see all of those sort of photos of the dead bodies, and it was shocking in the 1860s, but also it wasn't shocking in that, you know, death photos are actually pretty common by that point, almost from the beginning of photography, which isn't that much kind of earlier before. And so I think the two go hand in hand. What is certainly true is there is a shift in tone with some of the later war lyrics about death. It becomes much more about the noble sacrifice and dying, and some of the gore comes out. I say that because I used to think that Fredericksburg in actually December 1862 is a bit of a turning point, because it is such a shock value to so many groups. There are examples, and I've got one from Vicksburg, where the gore comes back, but actually the tone as the war moves on to 63, 64 onwards, there is a slight more mournful and melancholy tone to the deaths. But again, death is still appearing as a concept in the songs, or a reality in the songs. And so, you know, it's again still not being avoided or kind of moved around. You don't see, by comparison to big poetry shifts that happen in the First World War, you don't see any real anger coming out about these deaths. That the idea of futility and the futility of these deaths is something that is into the 1900s by when you get that. So it's an immediate kind of shift. There's still nobly sacrificing all the way up to the end of the war.
Yeah, that's an interesting point of comparison with World War I, and one that I think we'll kind of probably touch on as we go. Before we go on, just want to give a shout out to Marcy for becoming the newest member of the National Museum of Civil War Medicine. Thanks for joining during the program, Marcy. We really appreciate that. And again, becoming a member is the best way to support the museum as we go through these. And I see in the comments another friend of the museum, Damian Shields, is tuning in. It says Catherine's work is fantastic. This is a really fascinating topic. So thanks, Damian, for tuning in and saying such nice things.
The newly doctored Damien, I should say, actually. So
oh, wonderful.
yeah.
Well, congratulations on that. So that's excellent. I want to start getting to some specific examples now, Catherine, but before we do, interesting question from Gary in the comments. He asked, was music promoted as therapy during the war, such as how music therapy is used today?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. We touched upon this actually at the end of the discussion back in November as well. Not as a specific, we're put on this and it will make you feel better, or should, you know, kind of as a restorative mindfulness treatment. There's an awareness that music and song would certainly have sort of restorative, you know, it's good for the soul, but they're pussyfooting around the science of that in the 19th century, and they don't realize its full medical impact. I don't think we actually even, it's only been very recently, I think we've fully realized this. In saying that, when troops, particularly in winter encampments, and sometimes actually in the hospitals themselves, if they could, they sometimes had regiments who were in the area put on performances. So there's one group of Massachusetts soldiers who have their own thespian troupe to put on little performances, which are probably sketches lifted from music halls that they were familiar with in the 1850s and 60s. And I know for a fact that they're singing kind of traditional songs from kind of older cultures at those as well. And there's one particular event where the show goes really well, but the best bit is that they're all given rum afterwards. And this is a particular note that's kind of emphasized several times. so there are moments like that. There are it depends on where the hospitals are, but if they're allowed to, I know of one example where they're bringing in musical instruments as well, not for those who are injured to perform unless they were able to. It's more for others to perform for them. But I think that was more of a to break up the day as opposed to actually have any sort of deliberate effect on their mental health. But actually, in so doing, given the fact that this is all recorded then in memoirs, it's clearly had that mental health effect and has been very beneficial. So they knew what they were doing, but didn't know what they were doing, is my kind of argument to that, which seems to be quite a lot of a lot of Civil War history is quite like that.
That statement could be applied to a host of things in Civil War medicine. They knew what they were doing, but they didn't at the same time. I mean, they're so close to so much of what we do in modern medicine, but in just as many ways they're miles away from it. And just to underscore what you said, Catherine, that's sort of what I've come across in my research as well. Music is more just like something to do because they're just sitting in these hospitals, and it has the added benefit of being a major positive for the soldiers.
Yeah.
So let's go ahead and dive into some of the examples of the songs that you brought for us today.
Yeah, well, I thought I'd start actually with ones that people may know, or at least are more familiar with, because they're the sort of Civil War songs that have in the kind of top 20 of Civil War songs. They're the ones that have kept on being passed down in CD collections and Civil War documentaries, as a kind of just a snapshot of the general ease you into the gore, basically, sort of the general nature of it. So one, for example, the very famous Root and Katie song, Just Before the Battle Mother, most of that is talking to the fictional mother away on the home front and kind of thinking about that right before going to battle. But at the very end of that song, there's just the creeping shadow of death comes into one of the final lines about how it references battle cry of freedom and rallying around the flag, and it says, yes, we'll rally around the flag, or we'll perish nobly there. And the idea that we're ready to fight, but we might not make it. And it's just there at the very end, and it's there's sort of like a gateway into some of this kind of rhetoric that you see in songs. There's a similar theme appears in one of a Civil War song that it's seen on both sides. It's quite common and for both the Union and Confederates to sing this, which is When This Cruel War Is Over, which is often seen as being an anti-war song. It's a bit more complicated than that, but it's sort of, again, hoping for a kind of reunion post battle. And again, it talks about how the sense of noble falling in battle, only this time around it's less positive. So where you've got Just Before the Battle Mother kind of saying, well, if we perish, it's okay, it's a noble sacrifice. When the cruel war is over, it talks about how, this goes back to the oral idea, actually, if amid the din of battle nobly you shall fall, far away from those who love you, none to hear your call, which is actually pretty horrific. The idea of it's great, you will die on the battlefield, but also if it's right in the middle of battle, it's so loud no one's going to actually hear you, and so you'll sort of die alone, and effectively with no one around. And then it goes on to say, who would whisper words of comfort, who would soothe your pain, which you can kind of see is why that might work as an anti-war rhetoric, is this idea of, do you really want to fight, because there is a kind of consequence to the action.
Well, it's evoking sort of the similar ethos of those infamous photographs of the dead at Antietam, these bodies, kind of horrifically disfigured bodies, alone and clearly away from their families. It evokes a similar idea, I think.
Yeah, and that idea of have you really thought this through, and the idea that where you sometimes see, I'm writing quite a lot about the First Battle of Bull Run at the moment, and the idea that was such a shocking, what happened at that battle was so shocking as a shock value, because no one had thought about actually how is this war going to play out. And so it's sort of a similar thing of, with the fighting comes the consequences. The idea of the sound of death and dying is also there as a comparison, actually, in All Quiet Along the Potomac, which again was a very another very popular song on both sides of the divide. And this one is a little bit different, because there, you know, you have When This Cruel War Is Over saying no one's going to hear you if you die in battle. All Quiet Along the Potomac, as the title gives it away, talks about the fact that it's all very quiet as they're resting kind of either side. Occasionally a private or two will talk about the news of the battle. They'll rejoice about the fact that not an officer has been lost, only one of the men, but they are moaning out all alone, and you can hear the death rattle. The song talks about the death rattle. And so again, it's this sort of this sound of death and being present, but it's also one that's quite, that song is very calming and very soothing. So it's sort of still saying it's all okay, which again speaks to the way in which death is seen in the 19th century. To us, it's still all pretty horrific, but it's sort of seen in a more soothing manner. And kind of one kind of big final example of more common songs that people will know. The best example of this is probably the opening two verses of The Drummer Boy of Shiloh, which is a song that gets heavily probably overstudied, actually, because everyone's been trying to work out exactly whether or not this is a real drummer boy or if it's a fictional drummer boy. The person it's based on, John Clem, who fought in the 22nd Michigan, he didn't die. This is a spoiler warning. These two verses talk about a drummer boy dying. He didn't. He lived till 1915. So, and he also probably wasn't at Shiloh, but that's a whole other story. But the first two verses talk about, and this sort of eases into the blood and the gore. On Shiloh's dark and bloody ground, the dead and wounded lay. Amongst them was a drummer boy who beat the drum that day. Oh, it's a really simple rhyme, this song. A wounded soldier held him up. His drum was by his side. He clasped his hands, then raised his eyes and prayed before he died. "Oh, mother," said the dying boy, "look down from heaven on me. Receive to me thy fond embrace. Oh, take me home to thee. I've loved my country and my God. To serve them both I tried." He smiled, shook hands. Death seized the boy who prayed before he died. And what's quite interesting, I think, about that one is that actually, unlike the mother in Just Before the Battle Mother, the mother in the Drummer Boy of Shiloh is already dead. She's supposed to be the one greeting him after death. And so again, it talks to the kind of prevalence of death and the kind of commonality of death in society in the 19th century, and that, you know, it's the moving on process is certainly something that these songs still try to capture, with a healthy dose of the religiosity, which will come into some of the other examples I'll talk about in a bit.
Yeah, fascinating. And the fact that, you know, there's sort of like going to be a reunion happening with the drummer boy and the mother, that even though this is an objectively sad moment, it makes it sort of a little bit more hopeful in ways that maybe we might not see with some of the other tunes you're going to bring up.
Yeah, it's almost like the sort of, I can't think of specific examples. It's sort of very Dickensian, the sort of almost saintly child who's, you know, going to be ushered back in to the gates of heaven with the mother there, and kind of with a warm embrace. It's a very kind of powerful image.
Absolutely. Got an interesting comment that I'm going to sort of turn into a question here from Randy. She writes, "Being a military brat, I grew up hearing gruesome parodies of popular songs that were for insiders only, sort of like insider cop or nurse humor. Like, would there be an element to this, maybe with some of the other songs we're going to get to, where, you know, it's sort of the soldiers trying to do what they can to sort of make light of what is a kind of not a great situation? Is there some an element of that maybe?"
That's a really interesting question. I think actually the closest one is probably the example I gave with When This Cruel War Is Over, about kind of, you know, part of that song, the other lyrics do mock some of the pro-war sentiment. It's also a kind of reference, there's references in some versions, there are lots of versions of that song, and so there's some references to the draft and being forced to fight as well. And so the idea, I think, of that, you know, no one's going to hear you amid the din of battle if you die, is probably a bit of a mocking. You know, you're not going to have this kind of picturesque death that the Drummer Boy of Shiloh has, I think. But in terms of other examples of that, I've not seen kind of that element of it. They're all pretty much the common theme again is that noble sacrifice, or that the deaths are sad, but that at the end of the day there is a bigger purpose, and that bigger purpose is reunification of the country for the Union, or fighting for Confederate independence of the Confederacy. You see it on both sides where they're both talking about death in battle. So yeah, it's an interesting question. I must go do some digging actually, but
yeah, definitely an interesting thought. I'm gonna think more about that as well. We've had a few other people sign up as members. Thank you to Joanne and Erica for joining during the program. We appreciate it. Thank you for letting us continue to do what we do. Mary asks a good question that I think there's thankfully a pretty simple answer to. She says, I would love to hear some of these songs as I'm not familiar with all of them. And I think we spoke to this when you were on last time, the best way to look up Civil War music is to go to YouTube and just type in the title. And you might need to add Civil War song on the end or something like that. But is that the best way if people want to listen to some of these?
Absolutely, yeah. All of the ones that I've just mentioned in that kind of first part, they're all there are many versions of those that you'll find on YouTube because they were, as I said, they will be in the top 20, and so it tends to be the really, really popular songs of the 11,000 that have come down to us, and there are lots of different recordings. So yeah, YouTube is actually the best place to find Civil War songs or versions of Civil War songs. Some get their lyrics tweaked every now and then, but yeah, that's where I would head. To where I head sometimes to try and work out tunes.
Yes, excellent. Yeah, those are all quite common ones. Okay, you want to take us through another few examples here? Go to stage 2, as it were.
Stage 2. Stage 2. Specific. I'll give you some specific kind of moments or areas of kind of particular battles and kind of particular moments that make it into song. So actually, this does kind of sort of relates back to that question about whether or not actually they're satirizing any of this, and it's not really satire, but one specific example that you often see in very, very early war songs are songs referencing the death of Elmer Ellsworth and the kind of impact that, he's allegedly the first Union officer to die in a skirmish in Virginia, and he is massively lamented as sort of this young heroic man who's slain in his prime, and there's it's actually a bit of a jokey song. It's called The Goose Hangs High No. 2. So there are like several versions of this song. The title of that song has nothing to do with the lyrics I'm about to give you, but Ellsworth appears in it about how his unit lost their young commander. So it's again this idea of the sort of very young death, and that this is really sad, but it's okay because it's for the Union that he did die. And so this idea that his is the sacrifice that everyone should be following, and it's certainly as I said, Ellsworth creeps up in many early 1861 songs as being the person to follow. Well, the Confederacy, or certainly one songwriter in the Confederacy, didn't necessarily agree with this, and so they penned a song. It is not a great titled song called To the Memory of Jackson of Alexandria, Virginia, which the death of Ellsworth happens near Alexandria from my memory. And this appears in the 1861 Confederate songbook. And it's the reason I know of this is because it's set to a Robert Burns tune, which sort of ties into research I look at about the way in which Celtic tunes become American in the 19th century. And this song is dedicated to the a Confederate man called James W. Jackson, who was also killed in the skirmish that killed Ellsworth. And it talks about how Jackson was slain by brave invaders coming from the Union, literally not that far away. And that, it also talks about the fact that Ellsworth was shot in quite graphic detail. But to avenge, it should be Jackson who should be avenged, not Ellsworth, and that the Union were full of minions low and vile for killing him, which I think is the only time I've ever seen the word minions appear in a Civil War song, which is an interesting reference to modern day contemporary minions. And so yeah, these are kind of very specific targeted songs referring to particular deaths of people and about actually the idea of avenging death, which is a kind of a running theme, particularly in kind of speeches that are given certainly after the deaths of particular commanders during the war. There's also another kind of a song again about this noble sacrifice, but on a more specific level. There's a song called "Lay Me Down and Save the Flag," which is a Union song that's pretty much dedicated to standard bearers and to those carrying the flags on the battlefield, who as many people have noted in works and stuff like that, that if you're carrying the flag, it's a great honor to be the color bearer, the standard bearer, but it's also horrifically dangerous because you are the most obvious target to a sharpshooter or to anyone you are happening to be charging at with the flag. And there's one example of someone who I look at, a very famous Irish example of a service in the war by a guy called Peter Welsh, who becomes a colour bearer and actually writes to his wife and tells her not to stop worrying, because clearly in the meantime she's been writing to him going, why did you take this job? Because suddenly you now have the target on your back. So "Lay Me Down and Save the Flag" is all sort of dedicated to colour bearers and standard bearers. And then very quickly at the beginning of this song, it talks about the dying hero, because these are kind of heroic men, who is shot, and he shouted, "Lay me down and save the flag." In other words, leave me on the battlefield, the next person has to go. And then this keeps going on through as more and more people kind of carry this flag. And there are sort of several examples in the actual war itself. These are sort of pseudo fictitious stories that are happening in the songs, but in the actual war itself, we do know of several examples of the injuries that befell colour bearers and the way in which those who survived them are massively glorified. In fact, Damien and I have both written about one particular famous Irish example in the 28th Massachusetts, or 21st Massachusetts, called Plunkett, who loses both of his arms at Fredericksburg, amongst them a whole other load of injuries for carrying the flag. And even Clara Barton writes about him, because she comes across him and talks about the blood obliterating the red on the stripes of the color that he's carrying. And again, it's that sort of same that idea that the flag becomes a symbol, and so one's life is not important, but the flag is important because the flag represents the country. In this case, it's representing the Union, or literally America, because many of these colors are actually versions of the Stars and Stripes. And it's something that there's one Civil War song called "Hurrah for the Union," so guess which side it's on, which talks about, again, the millions, not minions, millions rallying around the flag, which no power can subdue. We can die, but we cannot put down the red, white, and blue. And it's a continual idea of holding up the flag, which becomes the thing. So it becomes this noble sacrifice, but also if you actually then attach it to the symbols of the Stars and Stripes, becomes even greater as a thing.
Yeah, it's interesting. These songs you're highlighting, are ways for soldiers and citizens really too, I guess, to make meaning of the intense amounts of death that they're experiencing. That it's for the purpose of the symbol, these noble sacrifices that you've mentioned, and things of that. No matter how horrible the deaths were, they mean something. They will mean something, and all that sort of stuff. Just the role that music and art plays in meaning making.
Yeah, absolutely. And for the Irish, and actually pretty much for every immigrant unit in particular, that aspect of it is that I think that's probably why you actually see more about death and injury and dying for the nation in those songs than you do in general other songs, because they link loyalty to the Union with this sacrifice, and the idea that actually their deaths are really important because they are sacrificing for the nation. And so there's one 1863 song about the Irish Brigade. I mean, there are many Irish brigades. I'll talk about a few more later. which sort of rallies at the very end with a onward to victory, onwards to death, and the union forever with your last dying breath. And then return, about the fact that when regiments were returning, and this sort of ties around sort of times where the Irish Brigade was actually kind of changing over and kind of some units were going back to their home states. It talks about returning those flags, returning those regimental banners. If they're covered with blood, they are covered with glory. And that actually, you know, this is, what more can we do to prove our loyalty and our commitment to the union for these immigrant groups by kind of actually showing, look, we're shedding our blood for you, and here is the physical proof of it. And I should say about Plunkett, the physical proof is still there. The actual flag is not on display. It's a version of it in the Massachusetts State House, where I've seen kind of pictures of the real thing, and there's some very large, big, now quite brownish splodges, which are allegedly from Plunkett. So, you know, this is physical proof too.
Wow, yeah. And it's sort of a contrast to World War One, kind of like we talked about before. I think perhaps, you know, it makes more sense that there'd be this sort of it's a little bit easier to make meaning in a civil war, because you're either fighting for the country to not be divided or to have the creation of a new country. And, you know, that there's a very specific, concrete, tangible outcome of the war. Whereas something like World War One, you know, I think the larger ideas of what they're fighting over are a little bit more obscure to the soldiers themselves. Now, I'm not a World War One expert. I think World War One soldiers are probably a little bit more politically savvy than I just gave them credit for. But it's a little bit different there, I think.
Yeah, certainly. I'm currently teaching African American World War One history at the moment. They're definitely again, it's minority groups. It's actually groups who have the fighting is more of they have more of a stake in it. And I think, yeah, when you're right, civil conflict and conflicts where you're fighting for certain ideals that groups will latch onto. So the ideas of fighting for democracy when you are denied it at home, and certainly in the First World War period, that is something that you definitely see. I kind of some of the prep for this talk, and one of the kind of preparation questions that you asked was about, do you see this in other wars? So I went for a little bit of a hunt to the Crimean and see whether or not there was anything. And the thing that jumped out at me, and I only think about this because it also gets printed quite a lot in Confederate songsters as a kind of lyric poem, is Tennyson's very famous what's it called, Charge of the Light Brigade, and kind of talking about the Balaclava in 1854. And that's where, I mean, that song is all about the Valley of Death and the jaws of death, but actually there is no injury in it. I've gone through it several times, and so I've got the 600, they charge and then they sort of die off screen. There's no, it talks about the horse and the hero who fell, and it talks about this noble charge, but there's none of the specifics that you then see in the Civil War. And I think that probably goes back to that point of, you know, in the Civil War, they're latching onto kind of much bigger things. So the Crimea, it's in a kind of abstract thing that they're dying for. But there is a, I'm not going to do the whole thing because it's 13 stanzas, but there's an amazing lyric ballad poem about Fredericksburg, which has a very Charge of the Light Brigade feel, because it talks about, you know, with shot and yell and stunning peal, their vengeance leapt upon their steel, as the Irish Brigade are charging up Mary's Heights at Fredericksburg. And it then moves into talking about the fact that, you know, they're covered in sweat, and then they're covered in ribbon gore because they're picking up kind of blood spatters from their own injuries and from the men around them. And then it talks about the crimson red currents flowing on the battlefield. So it's a comparable Tennyson-esque lyrical ballad poem of war, but it's much more specific, which ties into all these other 1860s examples of sort of not shying away from all of this and the visceral image of seeing the blood flow.
To use your example, the death is happening on screen as opposed to off screen.
Oh yeah, in full Saving Private Ryan, you cannot escape this. In fact, there's if we want to get into the real gore here, there's my favorite Irish American Civil War song, which is Pat Murphy of Mars Brigade, which I think
I love that one too.
I
That's
think
a great tune.
I think we talked about that last time as well. Well, it talks about, again, about the blood in our cause, the cause of the Union shedding freely. And then there's a whole verse which is about the scene as the battle is over and how the dead lay in heaps. There's poor Pat Murphy, who's bleeding and gory. And then it describes how a hole through his head from rifleman shot ended his passion for glory. Now, every time I do this to actual audience I can see, every time I could be, everyone goes, oh God. Like, I knew one of my supervisors hated me continually referring this, because it comes at you, like, without warning of, oh God, that's what happens to poor Pat. But it's that is something that you would not see particularly in the First World War. You wouldn't see poems or song lyrics being that explicit. There are some anti-war poetry later on that kind of talks about death, but the actual kind of seeing of the idea that he's shot through the head with rifleman shot, and the fact that then it goes on to talk about how Pat Murphy, who sings all these songs in camp, is not going to be singing them anymore. I think part of it ties to what James McPherson talks about in that incredibly influential book about Cause and Comrades, is that there's no censorship in the Civil War, which is why you could do a whole other talk about the way in which all of this is actually in all the memoirs and the letters, to an extent. I think sometimes there's self-censoring going on in some of the letters, but certainly the memoirs of some of the men that I look at and even some of the wives and the kind of nurses as well, are pretty explicit when they're talking about what they've witnessed and what they've seen. And so, a hole in the head from rifleman shot wouldn't have shocked Civil War society. It would have, again, it's that commonplace of death and acceptance and discussing death in society. And that has changed. That changes massively by the time you get to the 20th century conflict, until it's again seen on screen come the 1960s.
Yeah, what a fascinating comparison. And of course, with that tune about Pat Murphy, it doesn't help that it's, at least I'll speak for myself, I find it to be an insanely catchy tune. Like it just will pop into my head somewhat randomly, and I don't really listen to the song that often, but it just happens to come into my mind.
It is. I very nearly started singing bits of it then, but yeah, it's a lovely tune, and I think that kind of adds to some of the sort of lamenting of it as well. It is a sort of, it's meant to be a lament, but it's also one that's quite passionate as well.
Mm-hmm. Interesting question in the comments. We've sort of touched on, or you've touched on it at various points, but I think it would be interesting just to address it specifically. Wayne asks, I'm curious about some songs being popular in both sides. How was the music shared? Was sheet music widely printed and distributed? How did that all function? How did certain songs get to be popular between both sides and certain songs just with one?
Yeah, that's a very good question. So for the very popular songs, it becomes, once something is printed, if you print it enough times, it's going to cross, particularly in areas where the two sides are very close together and are interacting together. And so, song sheets, on even just hearing the songs across, there are cases of, particularly at Petersburg, where soldiers are writing about what they can hear. They're not that far apart. And so soldiers sort of pick up that. And if they're, particularly for the ones I talked about right at the very beginning, these are songs that are being played in the parlors of the home front and are being printed and are slowly circulating around. And the big Confederate publication area of Richmond never really stops publishing. There are areas of New Orleans which are big for publishing in the Confederacy, but they stop in 1862, partly because Benjamin Butler stops them, because
there's some talk about censorship right there.
Yeah, that is censorship, but of course it doesn't work because I think I mentioned this in November actually. The minute a song is sung, you can't censor it. The minute something's out there, same now, like any redacted text, minutes it's out there, you can't get it back. So there are some publishers who, and there's somewhat that's being done on this at the moment, who are actually shipping their printings to publishers in the South as well, kind of awareness that that they might have a market. The Confederacy runs into a very quick problem from about mid 1862 onwards, is that with the decline of some of its resources, it runs out of paper, or there's not enough paper to go to things like song printing. And so Confederate songbooks, there's some which get printed every year just with new songs in it, and the gaps between the songs get very, very, very narrow because they are trying to save as much space on the paper. It's almost like they should have, I think eventually they'd have probably started doing what they do in the 18th century, where they write upside down across their own writing. You see Jane Austen doing that. I think they'd have probably started printing that way if they tried. So the Confederacy are limited kind of by the end of the war to what they can print. So they sort of print popular songs, and the songs particularly about mothers and about the home front and about Confederate, well, no, about country ideals that don't particularly reference either the Union or the Confederacy, they are cross-purpose. So there's one example called Our Country's Heroes, which talks about how there are so many of our country's heroes, I cannot name them all. They're found in every crimson field. So again, there's all that blood. Prompt to their country's call, in deathless verse, bards shall rehearse their praise through future time, which is sort of what I'm doing. Well, that's the Confederacy. It's a Confederate song. But it's one that is so generic, actually, it could probably creep into the Union.
Yeah, so sort of a clever marketing technique, just keep it vague, and that way it appeals to everyone. There's so many heroes in this country. I mean, I could name them all, but there's just so many.
Yeah, there's so many, and it then, if you wanted to, it's interchangeable. And I think lots of songwriters we don't know about, because actually most songwriters are ordinary people, and sometimes the soldiers themselves, who are often changing some of the bigger publications that Root and Cady or Horace Partridge or Oliver Ditson are publishing in Chicago, New York, and Boston. Those are the kind of main areas, but they're copying and they're borrowing, and then they're filling, for the song books, they're filling the rest of the space with the stuff that everybody in the 1860s would have known. So all the Burns stuff, and lots and lots of Irish traditional songs and Scottish songs and Welsh songs, and sort of and occasionally the Marseillaise from France, because they like singing that, particularly in the Confederacy. They love singing the Marseillaise. So yeah, there's all that going on as well.
Fascinating. What an interesting little kind of subplot of Civil War music, the kind of distribution of all the songs. That's interesting. I've never even thought about any of that before.
Oh yeah, that's actually my newest area of research, and it's a whole other talk I could do about the fact that there's not really anything new, or what is new is actually come from everything else, and it's all borrowed. I mean, even songs like there's one called the Southern Warcry, which is another Confederate song. It's one of the other examples I found, which talks about the men whose blood, again, was freely shed, and then it goes back into the American Revolution, harks that. Well, it's borrowing certain lines that you see in kind of the bigger Union songs as well. It's all borrowed because A, they're universal tropes, but B, they're being sung so much and people are hearing them that both sides are picking them up.
Yeah, it's fascinating to hear, even though as much as I'm sure the Confederacy probably wanted to differentiate themselves, there is some degree, like with the Elmer Ellsworth counter song, the Jackson, but there is still this kind of common zeitgeist out there that they're all drawing from.
Absolutely. There's one songbook I've got, which is a preface by the editor, which is that the entire point of this book is to create a new national songbook, because we need to have our own songs, and we can't keep using the same songs that, we can't use Hail Columbia, we can't use, although they did, we can't use well, pretty much any song. We can't use the Star Spangled Banner, obviously. We can't, all of those big national anthems. So I think Christian McGuire sort of pointed out there's about 5 or 6 national, there's no official national anthem, but these national anthems. They've got to invent all of that, and that they will have original songs, and they will be, by the citizens. So there are actually competitions, both in the Union and the Confederacy, to write songs and to write anthems. the problem with this particular songbook is that by page 3, they're not new. They're all versions of older songs, or to be really totally new, you should probably throw out all the traditional songs from Europe as well. But they're all there as, you know, there's nothing new. And then there's loads of people I could point you in the direction of kind of reading about the idea of Confederate nationalism, but song culture and the lack of a specific independent song culture is certainly something that is there, worth exploring when it comes to the Confederacy.
Just goes to show being a really good artist is not easy, even though it might seem that way.
Yeah, and how it takes a while, and you need, even so there's one example actually by Harry McCarthy, who wrote the Bonnie Blue Flag. Anyone who knows me who's watching this knows that I love talking about Harry McCarthy because he's fascinating. Is this Scots-Irish songwriter who writes this, again, another anthemic song. That is I say it's an original song for the Confederacy, except it's set to an Irish tune that everybody in the country knew, and then there are loads of Union parody versions of it. But he, towards the end of the war, realizes he needs to kind of change track and not be so specific. So he writes one of his other songs is called "The Volunteer," and it talks about this soldier who's about to leave his sweetheart and go off to war. But again, he talks about how he's going to fight until fight on the battlefield on the blood red plain, and then we'll either conquer or we'll die. Now again, we'll conquer or die. Is that the volunteer for the Union, or is that the volunteer for the Confederacy? By that point, Harry McCarthy is kind of hedged his bets and is going both sides before he goes into full pro-Union songwriting that doesn't gain anywhere near the success of the Bonnie Blue Flag. He says an unglorious career at the end of his time as a Civil War songwriter.
That's actually somewhat amusing. I love the idea that, at least, I certainly don't pretend to know what he was thinking, but I love that, in this guy's mind, it's like, oh man, everyone's hanging on my word to know where I'm going to apply my artistry, whether it be for the Confederacy, for the Union.
Yeah,
this turning point of the Civil War, when he writes Union songs.
Essentially, yeah. That's I think what he's doing there.
A couple more shout outs. Thank you to Charles and Dennis for signing up to become members. Thank you for letting us continue to do what we do. Thank you for that. Quick question from Carolyn Ivanoff, member and friend of the museum. That 12 or 13 verse Fredericksburg song, can you give the title of that, please?
Yeah, it's called oh, hang on, I'm gonna have to look at our actual notes. I was at one point thinking, if I could kill time, I could just sing the whole thing. It's called the Irish Brigade. It's actually called just the Irish Brigade. I should point out that there are about 17 songs called the Irish Brigade, but this one's by a guy called Hugh F. McDermott, and I'm pretty sure it might be the only thing he ever wrote, because I've never seen his name crop up on anything else. And he wrote this, he wrote it, I'm pretty sure, either at the very end of December 1862, as the Irish Brigade is being memorialized after the battle in mid-December, or it's a very early 1863. And there are the copy of this that I found apparently was actually kept in the Massachusetts State House. It was found in the kind of committee rooms and coffee rooms, so it's sort of being circulated amongst the politicians to talk about what had happened. And yeah, it's a sort of ballad lyric poem, but a 13 verse is probably not going to be sung, but you could easily bend it into a song too. But it's very good, and then at the end it sort of becomes this highly kind of glorified death, and the religiosity of it all again, which is, we can actually come on to talk about that, about why I think some of the blood appears in these songs, because it definitely goes into that one in that song. It's a good song. But yeah, the Irish Brigade by Hugh F. McDermott. Got
it. And then another great question, this one from Erica. Were there songs that were specific to the United States colored troops, and did they have their own repertoire of music that they would sing? Yeah,
it's really interesting. It's not my main area of research, and I think this probably says a lot about the way in which Union society used and viewed USCT troops, in that they don't appear in the songbooks that appear kind of 1864-65 songbooks. There aren't really real references. There's some throwaway lines about soldiers fighting, but not African American soldiers fighting, but not anything specific. I know. I'm pretty sure Hillary Green, who writes a lot about particularly post-war African Americans and African Americans in Reconstruction, found one version of what is set to the Bonnie Blue Flag and the Irish Jaunting Car tune that is about African American soldiers fighting, but I, off the top of my head, cannot remember what the song is actually called. And I think it's still kind of come in her newest stuff, but it's not actually an area that I massively know, and it's not one that my hunch initially, but I would have to do more research into it, is that if there were ever any songs, publishers weren't publishing them, because I suppose actually that goes back to censorship, that ultimately the people who have the most power are the publishers, who are the ones kind of producing all these songs, and I can't think of ones really circulating properly. Versions of songs that were already in existence do get reshaped and reframed once USCT troops come in. So We Are Coming, Father Abraham that continually goes through new versions as more and more troops are called up, and then it gets tied to African American service, you definitely do see occasionally are references to slavery ending as well, and they don't sing about it very much, but there are occasional kind of references about the fact that even that Fredericksburg example by McDermott talks about how, for however horrific events were at Fredericksburg, and I think he's writing this because the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation is already out, and they know what's coming in a few weeks' time with the Emancipation Proclamation. It talks about when slavery has ended and nature's law returned, and the idea of returning to this union that is all united. It's a slightly noble aim. You do see references to that, but nothing really that specific, which is weird because there's a lot in print culture, certainly, of kind of drawings and ephemera that way.
Yeah, so there you are, prospective researchers. There's a topic that we could use more work on. Well, time flies when you're having fun. We're coming to the end of our time here. I know we had, and you had a number of different things queued up. As we're coming to a close, either we can take this wherever you want to go. Either you can highlight a few more specific songs, or if you want to kind of conclude us in some way, or do both along the way, wherever you want to go, take it.
I think I'll return to the kind of this sort of the noble element of some of all of this, and the fact that kind of within all of this is a bit of calm behind a will to do. And I'm actually going to very quickly, because that I've got these, very quickly see if I can share the screen to show. These are a couple of images that come from songbook covers. One which is one that I've written about on the museum blog before, about nursing in the Civil War, and you can see the hospital behind. The other, Our Captain's Last Words, is a song by Henry Work, and there you can actually see the bullet wound there of this officer dying. And I think those calming images of death and dying and being looked after injury are ones that actually kind of pervade some of the songs. So while you have there's a song about the first Bull Run that talks about the dreadful slaughter of that day and the moans of the dying and the wounded that make your blood run cold, and the horrid slaughter of the scene about the soldiers lying bleeding on the plains. While you have those kind of elements of the kind of early war songs I was talking about, there's also still this idea that there's, as one other song talks about it, that, as long as the lifeblood and all this sort of sacrifice is done for a noble cause of kind of holding up the country and holding up the standard, then as another Irish Brigade song puts it, no matter how much carnage and slaughter is being surrounded, this lifeblood and this sacrifice is a noble thing. And I think that ties into a common thing, this idea of the blood being like a lifeblood and this sort of sacrifice if I know that it's there in the Bible. I'm gonna have to paraphrase this because I don't know my Bible as well enough as I should, about the fact that if I offered up a sacrifice, or I offered up or poured out my life as a sacrifice, then I would do it nobly for somebody else, which is somewhere in the Bible. I know that, and I think particularly for the Irish, this is a common thing because most of the Irish soldiers are fighting are Catholic, and so there's a connection to that kind of religious element to it. But it's a common theme that's spreading around society as well, and about the fact that, despite the fact that there are all these bullets and these men falling, it's done for a higher purpose. And I think that's sort of particularly encapsulated by that image on the right of the captain dying, that you can see the blood pouring out, but it's a calming picture. And if he survives, he'll end up being in this kind of calming hospital where, again, that sacrifice will be looked after and honored. And I think that's what, for all the fields of blood that soldiers have waded, as one song talks about at Vicksburg, it's all done for this sort of higher purpose. And that's the kind of rallying cry. Just like the flag, the blood sacrifice itself is a rallying cry. I think that would be how I would view it, as what's going on with these songs.
Yeah, that's a great point about, the continual references to blood is to, elevating it to be this symbol that the blood that is spilled is for something.
Yeah.
And that's definitely something that I've taken away from this, all the songs you brought up here.
Yeah, and it becomes very kind of that's where the other great connection was is a Christ-like sacrifice. I think that's, you can maybe go too far into that, and kind of the idea that the Union somehow is Christ. But again, it's something that, again, as for a civil war, you would shed more freely, because it's the stakes are very, very high about what it is that you're dying for.
So thank you so much for being with us today, Catherine. This is great. Patrick asked, how can we follow your research? I think you're pretty active on Twitter, is that right?
I am very active on Twitter, especially at the moment. I'm currently co-organizing an online conference, so my tweets are about coming to that in next week. So yeah, my Twitter is @Bateson. And that's the easiest place to find me. And then if anyone's commenting on Facebook or whatever, I will actually go through and properly reply to some of the questions on there as well, which I still have to do for November, actually. So I'll just do it with a massive go and get in touch with people that way.
Splendid. And, you all know how to get in touch with the museum as well. We're happy to relay things on to Catherine. So yeah, this has just been delightful. I hope you all enjoyed watching. Judging by some of your comments, it seems like you did. So thank you so much for that. Best way to stay up to date with the museum, make sure you like us on Facebook, subscribe to us on YouTube. We do programs like this 2 days a week, and they continue to live on the Facebook page and the YouTube channel. So if you missed something, you can go back and rewatch these at your leisure on demand. So we've developed quite a library by this point. We've been doing these for just about a year. So if you enjoyed what you heard today and you missed the last time Catherine was on, you can go and rewatch that as well. So there's all kinds of great stuff. You can support the museum by liking and sharing this video, liking us on Facebook, subscribing to us on YouTube, and becoming a member of the museum for as low as $25 a year. You can't go more than that. We won't stop you. And thank you to those who joined today during this program. We really appreciate it. Let's see, I think we'll be back tomorrow. When I say we, I mean neither of us will be back. It'll be Jake and Tim Talbot from Pamplin Historical Park down near Petersburg, talking about USCT participation in the Battle of Newmarket Heights. So that should be a good one. Make sure you tune in for that. So until next time, this is John and Catherine signing off.